Hey, Jennifer, so glad to have you on the podcast. Let's talk about canning. How's that?
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I just want to ask you, we're talking about pressure canning in particular, and I don't think we've ever had an episode that's been completely dedicated to pressure canning, but I think that people have some hesitancy around it if they've never done any kind of preserving before. What do you think people's fears are about pressure canning?
That's a great question. I know people have a ton of fear around pressure canning, and I think that's partially due to not urban legends, but rural legends of some relative long ago or someone that they knew didn't follow the directions that are included with every pressure canner. And they had the lid blow off the top, or they had some sort of scary thing happen. And that frightens tons of people away from pressure canning, which is a shame because I think if you follow the directions included with your pressure canner, you will not have any issues. They're really, really built now with lots of safety features in place. And there's many ways that you can avoid trouble. And there's just, I almost think that with pressure canning, there's less opportunity or fewer opportunities for the canner to make a mistake than with water bath. Water bath canning is actually, there's a lot of chances for you to go off script, so to speak. Whereas pressure canning is very clearly just follow the steps.
Yeah, I felt that way too. When I first started pressure canning, I'm like, I think I like this better because once you figure out the process, to me, it's less like having to mess with a whole lot of water and it's more straightforward. Do you think people are concerned about the safety aspect of it more so than water bath, or is that just a general fear? I'm talking about this, not the safety of the canning process, but the safety of the product.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think they are. I think there's just a lot of fear around, like, I'm 40, right? So I'm an elder millennial. And I feel like my generation or the Oregon Trail generation, I feel like we had moms who were at work, and a lot of people in my generation didn't have a lot of instruction on food safety, food preparation, of course, gardening. A lot of those home arts just were sort of left out. And I think in the absence of instruction comes fear.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and how wonderful that women were working and pursuing careers, and that no shade on that generation at all, but I think that gap left a vacuum for fear to fill, and that's why I think we get a lot of fear around food safety, around canning, around pressure canning in particular, for sure.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but I have thought a lot about the generation gap because I'm with you. I'm 43, which I think would put me at the tip top. My husband's Gen X, so we're like really close, straddling that. But I agree. Like my mom went to work. She was the first one to get a college education, and I remember her canning very briefly in the summer before she went back to work. She was a school teacher, but she never taught me. I don't have a clue what she did. I just remember the kitchen smelled like terrible. It smelled like tomatoes. I hated the smell of tomatoes. But I wouldn't have had a clue how to do any of it because she didn't teach me, and my grandmother had passed away, before I ever tried. So I think that is a very good point, and that we just don't know how. But when I was starting to learn how, I realized it's not rocket science, it's not rocket science. It's not really that hard, but you took it a step further. So I'm a self-taught food preserver. I read the Ball book. That was my first book. And then I continued my education, but you took another step and you became a master food preserver. And I would love for you to explain what that is. And then why'd you even decide to pursue that?
Sure. So many in your audience may know that the university for your state's cooperative extension office offers master gardener programs. Most, if not all states have that, right? So similarly, most states offer a master food preserver program. And I'm told that it's shorter, so that might be interesting for some of your listeners. The master gardener program is pretty lengthy, I think. So I wanted to take it because I'm a teacher in my day job. Um, and I just love learning from experts. I love having the opportunity to ask questions. I love learning hands-on. I love just diving deep onto a subject and learning all the things. And when I started my blog, I didn't start out with canning content, but people were asking lots of questions about it, and I knew there was a huge gap of information and I wanted to be able to fill it, but I also knew how much misinformation was out there on the internet. So I wanted to really fill that void with rock solid scientific great advice for beginners and or people who were like you, like knew about canning but maybe hadn't done it themselves or were looking to self-educate. So I live at the very tip top of California, and the nearest master preserver program to me was in Sacramento, which was a 5-hour drive. And most of the programs are set up either they're 5 days in a row or they're 5 or 6 or 7 subsequent Saturdays. So both of those weren't a great option. My kids are pretty young. And I, at the time that I was looking for a program, I had made Instagram friends with uh, Anna Cash, and her Instagram handle is at Smart Home Canning. And she lives in Ogden, Utah. And she invited me to take the Master Preserver program course in her home, in her town in Ogden. And so I did. And it was an awesome experience, and it achieved everything I would hope for. I learned all the things. I taste tested. I tested out a freeze dryer. I learned all the things and passed a pretty extensive test at the end. And that's how a person achieves their Master of Food Preserver certification.
And how long had you been canning prior to going to the doing that education?
Probably like 6 years.
So you had a decent amount of experience. What did you learn that you didn't know before?
Lots.
Really?
I have 2 great canning tips for your audience. One is about water bath canning and making jam. And the great takeaway tip I had from that program about making jam was that very often we ask one another or Google, what's a great jam recipe? And then we go purchase pectin to go with that recipe. And if you're new to canning, pectin is the ingredient that gives your jam that spoonable and spreadable thick quality. It occurs naturally in many fruit, but some fruit don't have very much. So in order to make a good spoonable peach jam, for example, you would use pectin. But the process you should do is you should get the pectin, whatever pectin you're going to use from the grocery store or Amazon, and then use the recipe that's included with that product, because that company is going to create a recipe that is perfect, and you're going to have the best result using that recipe. And then the best tip I learned for pressure canning that I think is most valuable for your listeners is that when you're pressure canning meat, most recipes give you the option to hot pack or raw pack. And raw pack means you just put raw chunks of meat into a jar and pressure can it. And hot pack means you pre-brown and season chunks of meat and then put it in the jars. And you would think, oh, definitely want a raw pack. That'll save a lot of time. And you can do that, and it's perfectly safe. But the taste difference when hot packing is so dramatically better. I never raw pack now. Never.
Are you talking about you
It's
never
so
raw pack
much
meat
better. Correct.
or anything?
Correct. Meat in particular.
Okay. One thing that
There's a lot of recipes for vegetables that it's better to raw or it's better to hot. There's a lot of variability there, but I would say red meat and chicken pre-brown all day long. Much better look, taste, palatability, everything. Way better.
that's a good tip. And honestly, I don't know that I've ever canned meat. I've only canned vegetables and
Sure.
broths. But one thing I want to bring up, now we haven't really talked about this yet, but those that are on YouTube can see
That's
this
okay.
is your book, and I'm going to refer to this because you brought up a point that I wanted to tell people. This is the Pressure Canning Cookbook, and what I really appreciated about what you wrote in here, there's a lot of things I appreciated, but
Oh,
you
thank you.
talked about the why. And just like you said, you could raw pack, but here's the texture difference. And you
Sure.
explained the why behind a lot of things. And that's the thing that I found was lacking when I was just doing the Ball Blue Book at the very beginning, was it says, here's your option, let's say for green beans, here's your option for raw pack, and here's your option for hot
Right.
pack, and
Yes.
nothing else. I'm like, tell me why.
How
Like,
do you know?
Yeah, which one?
Yeah, how do you choose?
And I didn't know what the difference was. And that just frustrated me to no end, but you do such a good job of explaining it, which I think, I don't know, maybe because of all the information that we have curated an inner skeptic and we want to know why. But I think if we actually take the time to learn why, then we become more confident in what we're doing because we understand the why behind something instead of just following a recipe. So I
I
appreciate
couldn't
that.
agree more.
Yeah.
I could not agree more. When we understand why there is a rule, if you explain to a child why they can't touch the hot stove, they might get hurt, right? If you give the reason, it's much more likely that someone will abide by a rule or understand why they're doing it, or they'll remember it. They'll remember to do the right thing. It's just so much easier, I think, when you give a why. So I'm glad you found that helpful.
You also mentioned that the reason that you went into this education to become a master food preserver was because there's so much information on the internet. And I'm sure when you see
Yeah.
things online, you cringe, just like I do, because, and probably even more so since you've got the education behind it and you see things that aren't safe and you know why they're
Sure.
not safe. But I'm going to play the devil's advocate here with you because I think you've seen this just like I have. There's all
Mhm.
sorts of recipes online that will show a particular way of canning something, and it's a shortcut, or it's something that I didn't see that in any of my ball books or the National Center for
Yeah.
Home Food Preservation, but they say my family's been doing this for, dozens of years, or this is how grandma did it.
Hmm.
And I get the sentiment behind that because I think, like you and I kind of talked about before, we kind of want to go back to what our grandmothers knew how to do without
Hmm.
question. Like we want to have that information, but there's a lot out there on the internet that doesn't conform to safe canning practices. However, personally, and you may correct me here, I don't see a lot of cases, even though these types of recipes are pervasive apparently. I don't see a lot of cases of foodborne illness from home canned goods unless I'm just not
Hmm.
watching the right kind of news. So, when I say I'm playing the devil's advocate, if it's so important to follow the safe canning
Sure.
practices, why aren't we hearing of more illness from people who are not following them?
That's a great question. So when I decided and started to write this book, I purposely joined two different huge rebel canning groups on Facebook. And I did that to see the kinds of problems people encounter and what the suggested solutions were. And I was trying to untangle, why do people rebel can? And rebel canning, for lack of a better description, is canning without adherence to food safety rules that we have known to be solid information since like 1917 is when the USDA said that pressure canning is the only safe way to pressure can low acid foods, right? So just as a side note, pressure canning is not new, nor is the food science supporting using that high heat to preserve low acid foods like meat and plain vegetables. So, what I observed in these Facebook groups and what I've continued to observe in my interactions with people on social media and on my blog is that with poor canning, the most likely result is food spoilage. And there's a lot of that. And if you were to be in a online environment where people were chatting about that, you would see there is a lot of food spoilage. The number of people that pressure canned raw milk, destroying the great microflora that's there, destroying all the good reasons that a person would consume raw milk, and to can it in a water bath. I can't even wrap my mind around what the thinking would be with that. When you can freeze milk, you can freeze dry it, you can make cheese, you can do all these different ways to preserve milk, but to water bath it and just create an environment where it's definitely going to be lumpy and gross, I just can't. I I still cannot understand what would compel people to do that. So you asked, why do we not hear about people getting really, really sick? I think that people get away with some really negative practices because other mistakes result in food spoilage before the bot toxin gets them. I think that's actually what ends up happening, because if you are rebel canning and you are like water bath canning low acid foods, let's say, which is unsafe, you also are probably including ingredients and in quantities that also are unsafe. So then you end up with food spoilage, or people eat it before it's going to be able to make them sick. And it's true. You don't hear about botulism in the news all the time. The USDA launched a re-education effort in the 70s because there was a surge of botulism cases in the United States. So that, coupled with all the moms going to work, right? All of our moms going to work, there's just a lot fewer people canning. And then I think the other thing too is just that they end up getting away with it because either the food gets spoiled or they are lucky and the bot spore doesn't develop That wasn't present on the surface of their carrots or whatever they're canning. But I actually have kept an eye on the news, and I do an occasional Google search for botulism cases in the U.S. And there's not very many. The bulk of the 2,000 botulism cases in the U.S. are for infants under 2 who consumed raw honey. They have a naked gut, and their tummies can't deal with the bot spore that is present. So it's not very common. You're right. It's not very common that people get very, very sick. However, botulism is not like an uncomfortable trip to the bathroom. It is a paralytic. Think about the Botox that paralyzes the muscles in between your brows. It's a scary, scary, scary thing. If you were to succumb to botulism, you would be lucky to live. So in my mind, if it takes just a little bit more time to properly preserve something and just completely eliminate the risk of that happening to me or my family, it is a no-brainer. But you're right, there's not very many cases of it occurring.
Yeah, I mentioned in last week's podcast episode where we talked a little bit about just the basics of preserving. And if those of you guys who are listening to this, you can go back to last week's episode. But my viewpoint is, why risk it? Kind of like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Follow what's safe. And the reason it's safe is because it's been tested in a lab. It's not just because someone created this recipe and just, stuck a label on it. It's been scientifically tested. And so I want to trust that,
Well, and it wasn't tested last week or during 2020 or when, a particular president was in office. It was tested so long ago. I mean, it was like a sign of patriotism to be canning correctly, first in World War I, then in World War II, and people were really interested in getting that good information. My grandmother is 92, and she's only one grandmother, right? But I asked her, when the new canning cookbooks or the new recommendations were coming out, I said, who do you think wasn't interested in those? And she said, she kind of has a dry sense of humor. She goes, well, maybe people who couldn't read. As in, at the time, everyone wanted that good information.
Yeah.
And I think when you start to ask about great grandma's recipe or grandma's recipe, many of those recipes that people are loving and clinging to were ball canning recipes. And they were tested. And maybe now we just have one little addition, one little quarter teaspoon of an acidifying ingredient to ensure that it's high enough acid for water bath canning, for example. So many people want to do what grandma did, but I think what grandma was doing was she was getting the recommendations and she was following the tested recommendations.
That's a really good point, for sure. And she probably wrote them down, and that's what gets passed on.
Yeah.
For sure. So what are the biggest mistakes that you would say you see in those? Let's talk about vegetables and fruit, what we're growing in our garden, because that's what most people who are listening to this podcast is they're doing. What would you say some of the biggest mistakes that you see people make, maybe in those canning groups that you're seeing, that we could fall into?
Yeah. Regardless of where you're getting your trusted canning information from, they're all going to recommend that you peel your potatoes, for example. Let's go with the potato example. And in the rebel canning groups, people say, I don't peel my potatoes, and they're not getting sick. And that's great. And I'm so glad that they're not. But the bot spore lives in soils. It's all over all kinds of things, and it doesn't cause any trouble unless it is in a low acid and no oxygen environment, which is exactly what's inside a canning jar that you have canned. Right? It needs no oxygen, which is sort of confusing to people. I think most people think, oh, you need air to grow spoilers, and many of them do require air, but that scary one doesn't. So by peeling your potatoes, you are physically removing the environment that is going to host it if it's there. So if you wash and scrub and peel your potatoes, yeah, that takes extra time. And I mean, I have kids and a job and a husband and a dog, and I have stuff to do too. But that doesn't take so much time that to me isn't worth it. I just will go ahead and peel my potatoes and then process them in the pressure canner, because that is removing the potential for that to be there.
I've heard that a lot about the root crops, and I can understand why with potatoes and carrots. But I've also heard some conflicting evidence on tomatoes, whether that is on tomato skins as well. Is that not as big of a concern since they're not growing in the ground? Or what's your thoughts on that? Or what's the official take on it? I don't even know.
Well, I should say now, I do not have a food science degree, so I couldn't speak with expertise on the likelihood of it being present on tomato skins, but I can tell you that all tested tomato recipes, whether water bath canned or pressure canned, now call for the addition of an acidifying ingredient, which will be citric acid, lemon juice, or vinegar. And that is because tomatoes today that you raise, even if they're heirloom, even if they're organic, even if everything, they are less acidic, they are more alkaline than 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So if you're using tested recipes, I wouldn't worry about the botulism. I would just think, am I following a tested recipe? And then I would do what the recipe says. Because again, many of us are not food scientists and we wouldn't necessarily have the knowledge of the other parts of that big food safety puzzle. But tomato skins, I did reach out to a cooperative extension. This is years ago, but I asked about peeling tomatoes. Okay. You can safely pressure can or water bath can tomato recipes with the skins on, but the only risk is like someone's Italian grandmother rolling over in their grave. There's no safety issue with it. It's just not as desirable. But what I do if I'm making a tomato sauce to can, I just blitz it in my blender, and the skins are minuscule, and I eat them that way. But I don't have an Italian grandmother.
Okay, so that sounds like the case then is that the potatoes and the carrots, all of those, it's growing in the soil. That's why it's more of the concern.
That's probably where I would pay particular concern.
Yeah. What other mistakes do you see?
Particular attention. I see people trying to save time by not peeling and by not following the steps outlined in your pressure canner's manufacturer's directions. So the times that people get hurt is when they are rushing to remove that lid that is under pressure. And I mean, the directions say wait until these safety devices, the devices on the lid that will signal, like just like on your Instant Pot, if you're new to canning, it's a lot like an Instant Pot that will tell you when the pressure has been released. And rushing to open that early, that's how people end up getting hurt. And again, that's not very common, but it's not a spontaneous combustion. It's because there's pressure built up and someone did not wait the amount of time required. And
Yeah,
then
I
I think just
that.
people are in a rush, and I get it. Like, I'm in a rush most of my life trying to be on time for things, but it's just not an activity that you should do rushed.
Yeah, my husband's always quick to tell me steam burns are the worst burns. And he
It's true.
works in a job where steam is a big deal. And I mean, even if we have waited the right amount of time, even when we do open that, you specifically say in your book, make sure to open it away from you because, I mean, that steam comes right at you and it could be dangerous. So, like you said, all the instructions tell you to do that. I have a question, and I'm not sure if this is a mistake so much, but it's something that I've noticed that occasionally happens to me, but I'm not quite sure the reason, but I think it's super common. I don't know that I've read the reason, and I would like you to just to define this for those who haven't heard. But I find this to be the case mostly if I'm canning black-eyed peas or if I'm canning potatoes, and that is siphoning, where the water level drops. And I know it's not a safety concern typically, but it's still not like doesn't look good and probably affects the quality. What's the most common reason for that to happen?
Well, okay, I'll just say don't beat yourself up because those are common. That is a common problem or issue, especially in peach halves, sometimes potatoes. I've never done the peas like you're saying, but that is common. That's a common thing that happens. And the best workaround is one, when you're filling the jars, to do your best to remove all the air. I use a spoon, but you can use the end of a wooden spoon. You can just do your best to remove all the air from the inside of the jar before you put your lid on. Then once you put your jars in your canner, this is true for water bath and pressure canning. When you are turning the heat on, go as gradually as you can. It's that quick change or that rapid heat increase that frequently causes that siphoning. I know with peaches that's especially true, and I'm sure in the pressure canner as well. So I would just try and turn it up as slowly as possible, which extends the time that you're canning, and that's nobody wants to take longer, but that is the hot tip.
I can definitely see where that is true because when I compare, I have done pressure canning on my cooktop and I've done, and now I like doing it more so on my Camp Chef propane stove just because lots of reasons, but I do notice when I get that heat and that pressure, just as soon as you put the little thing on
Yeah.
I forget what the names are, but
The
you,
weighted gauge. Yeah.
yeah, when you put that on and then it shoots up a lot quicker with that propane than it does on my cooktop, which is electric. I feel like it's
Yeah.
worse then. So you're
You're
saying
absolutely
it's
right.
when you're increasing the heat. Is there a
Yeah.
way for it to decrease too rapidly or not? Is it mainly in the
Well,
increase?
that's the hard part about canning outdoors. And I know everyone loves to can out on their Camp Chef or on their outside. You're heating up the outdoors. It's a lot easier. The mess is outside. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
But because you have the ambient temperature quite a bit different than the pot and you have whatever airflow just whipping away your heat, there's just going to be more change, more variability inside your pot, on the outside of the pot. You're going to have a lot more incidents of siphoning.
Mm, I can see that.
And if you're trying to make jam outside, um, that is really hard because the wind is pulling away your heat. And the longer you cook jam, the more likely you're cooking off the natural pectin that's present. And you end up with kind of like a gluey jam rather than a set jam.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point.
So I'm not hating on the outside, but those are problems you might encounter.
Yeah, and now that you say that, I'm thinking about my patio faces the west, and
Yeah.
sometimes it will depend on what time of day how easy it is
Yeah.
for me to maintain that pressure. Because
Yeah.
if it's really sunny and it's like 100 degrees outside, like it's going to be this weekend, it's a little bit different than
Yeah.
if it's a
Yeah.
50 or 60-degree morning. And I'd never really
Yeah.
considered that difference, but it really does.
If you're doing it outside, I would say maybe consider how about doing it in the garage or sheltered against, the corner of your house or just away from where there's going to be that air movement and a change in the temperature. You're just going to
Yeah.
have more of it. And think about it. If you're canning inside on an electric stove, your whole kitchen's warm. It's staying, everything is just a lot more consistent.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good. I'm learning a
Sorry.
lot today, and I've been pressure
I
canning
hate to
for
be the
11
bearer of
years.
bad news.
We could always get better. But I think what was most frustrating for me was when I pressure canned potatoes for the first time a couple of years ago, and I'd never
Mm-hmm.
tried it before, and I was so excited about it because we actually had a decent potato harvest, and then
Mm-hmm.
and they lasted. I think I ate the last one this year, so they lasted over two
Sure.
years. So and the
Sure.
quality was fine, but they weren't as pretty in the cabinet because
Yes.
the water level was lower.
Yeah, they do just end up looking kind of pitiful.
Yeah. Yeah. But like you said, that's common. And thank you for bringing that to our attention. I want to go back to the book in particular because, like I said, I started out with an old timey ball book, but I've
Mm-hmm.
recently bought the newer one just to make sure that I have, the most
Sure.
up to date. But I also have bought other canning recipes because there's something that you said in your book that you just got bored with some of the basic recipes, which is kind of how I found myself. I'm glad that I had that because I felt like I needed a place to start. But I started thinking, isn't there more to this? And your book, I think, is more unique than any of the other ones that I have seen as far as focusing on pressure canning and then giving so many different options of things that you can, including meals in jars, which I haven't really gotten too much into, but I know a lot of people love that idea. So knowing the canning books that are on the market or that you've probably read in the past, why did you write this book? What did you feel, what kind of a need did you feel like this book would fill that hadn't been filled before that you could offer?
That's a great question. I think before we hit record, you and I talked about that generation, and after we hit record, we talked about that gap in our generation. So I think the little bit of a gap that is in the pressure canning canon of cookbooks that are available today is that they are giving lots of basics with the expectation that the reader knows enough about pressure canning that they can assemble those basics into a meal in jar. And many people who are picking up a pressure canning book today are new to pressure canning and they did not have years and years of their grandmother or their mother pressure canning with them to show them the safe ways to assemble those basics, those safe recipes for pressure canning into chili, into stew, into all the different types of recipes I assembled in the book. And I think that's where the many pressure canning books miss the mark. They're assuming that the reader knows how to do that, and they don't, and many don't. So what I thought I would add, what I thought I could add as a writer and a mom and just a person who loves canning, I thought the thing I could add is I could add really good directions that would really put to rest fears and concerns and what ifs and how do I's for the new and the worried and unsure canner. And I hope that I did that. When I sat down at the very beginning of the book writing process to figure out what recipes would be in the book and what I had to start testing, I pulled out my regular cookbooks that I reach for to can or to cook regular supper for my family. And I filled them with post-it notes with ones that I thought I need to go back and figure out, can this be pressure canned? And if so, how? What time? What ingredient ratios? How can I turn this into a pressure canning recipe? I didn't work from the basics forward. I worked from best love things that my kids want me to cook for supper anyway, and I worked backwards. So there's lots of great information out there on cooperative extension websites all over. If you're not interested in purchasing a cookbook today, I would encourage you to search for pressure canning recipe for, whatever, you can fill in the blank, plus the search term cooperative extension. And then hopefully your browser will be smart and know, hey, if you live in Alaska, it'll pull up a walrus pressure canning recipe for you. Or if you're in the South, it'll pull up an okra recipe for you, or wherever okra grows best. So that's what I was going for when I sat out and planned out what I was going to test for my pressure canning recipes. I was choosing things that my family already wants me to cook.
I love that. And I would say you completely hit the nail on the head there, because one thing I noticed when I was reading the beginning parts of the book was this is so thorough and so easy to understand. And I mean, I'm looking at it having pressured canned for 10 years, but my thought was this is perfect for someone who has never pressured canned, because you don't make
That
any
is
assumptions
great.
that people know anything. You bring them from the very beginning and you tell them the why behind it. So I think too, besides the generation gap in general, that we don't have a basic knowledge, this might be part of it too. One thing that I've noticed is that my mom's generation, the baby boomer generation, the World War I generation, they were very trustful of authority. And
Sure.
we are not so much, we
Right.
question a lot. So you can't just necessarily say, okay, here's the recipe and just assume. Like, people want to know, well, can I change this and can I change that? And not that that's a
Right.
bad thing, but let's say I'm canning salsa and a member of my family doesn't like the heat anymore. Well, can I do a different pepper and switch it? Which the answer would be yes, but can I add more? No,
Correct.
but
Correct.
I think we're asking questions more these days
Yes.
too.
Totally.
But yeah.
You hit the nail on the head. That's absolutely the change in the attitudes. That's why, like, you're probably, our generation questions medical information. We question our doctors. We'll get a second or third opinion. We'll explore different options for schooling. Well, our generation is all about questioning, right? And that's great. That's so good. But if you question one or two questions deep in the canning information, you know that this information is super old and continually been tested, right? And it's actually very boring, and the people that are doing the science aren't making a whole lot of money, and it's easy to understand and easy to get behind, I think, when you know the why behind the canning safety.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful, and I think you put it together in a way that is very approachable for so many people that want to become, that want to fill that gap in. Okay, I'm going to be the new generation, and my kids are going to know how to do this from now
Right.
on.
That's so nice of you to say.
Well, what I want to ask you before we finish up is well, I have two questions. So you can tell me which one you want to answer first. I want to know, what is your favorite recipe from the book, and what do you wish everyone knew about pressure canning?
I wish that everyone knew that pressure canning is not expensive. It's not hard. You don't have to understand any of the food science, really, as long as you're willing to follow a tested recipe. And it can be such a time saver. Having a completely cooked, shelf stable jar you can just grab. And I mentioned I'm a teacher. If I can just grab this jar and put it in the car, and then I can heat it up in the microwave in the staff room at school, then I just have a whole meal that's not some packaged thing that costs a lot and didn't really fill me up. It can be such a time saver. I just think it can work for you. It's not, of course, learning any new thing can take time, and it's a experience to learn how to do it. But once you know how, it works for you. You're not working for that process. It is serving you in the way that many gardeners go through all this labor, right, to grow beautiful flowers and beautiful vegetables that are nutritious and better than what you can get in the store. It's the perfect companion, really, and it's much easier than you're probably thinking it is. And then my favorite recipe, well, I have lots of favorites, but one that turned out just so much better than I even could have hoped was this recipe for Portuguese pork, and it's vina de alos. And my husband's family immigrated to this country from Portugal, and it's his father, right? So when it's your mother that is bringing like the food information or the information about home, it's a different tale, right? It's a different story. So they always describe this food that their grandmother used to make called Vinnie Darless. And I thought, what is this Vinnie Darless? I Googled it. What is Vinnie Darless? Nobody could tell me what, like, nobody had a recipe. It was just, oh, grandma made this Vinnie Darless. It was Vina de Alos. But because, it wasn't, the recipe wasn't passed on through a matrilineal line, I had no idea for all these years what this wonderful recipe was. So the recipe in the book, that is one of my, I think, a total home run. It's not the family recipe, but it is a dang good Portuguese pork with apple cider vinegar, white wine, and it is flavorful and tender and delicious. And you would serve it and you would never know it was canned. It's delish.
Wow. Okay. I'll have to go back to that one. I think I remember looking at the title thinking, I don't know what this is. So
yeah, it's
I'll
wild.
have to go back. I love that. And I love that you mentioned that it's a time saver because especially this time of year, we are kind of busy in our garden, but so much of what you offered is, I mean, you have a section for vegetables, but you also have those sections for meals in jars that can be done any time of year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be during garden season.
Yeah, right. And I think that's kind of well suited for the off season for gardeners for the winter time. I think especially when you're combining potatoes and carrots and a piece of meat that you get on a great price or from someone who ended up butchering that I think it's a really good dovetail into that whole seasonal process that we love so much.
Yes, for sure. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been such a fun conversation. And for those of you guys listening, we will have a link to her book in the show notes if you're interested in that, checking it out. So thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.